All right, so far we've looked at how and why the colonists ultimately, left England and came over to the New World, the relationships that were established in the New World, the differences between the colonies, and then how, especially following the Seven Years' War, the relationship between the American colonists and the Great British had started to erode to the point where it seemed imminent for some form of armed conflict. And when we last were doing our notes, we talked about the idea of, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. These types of things are going to lead to such hostility, as well as the Townshend Acts and the Intolerable Acts, that ultimately full-on fighting breaks out with the shots heard around the world in Lexington and Concord. At the start of the war, there was very little doubt that Britain had the military superiority. They had the best equipped and most disciplined army. They actually had a standing army that had been training for years and years. I mean, Britain had this legacy of going out and conquering. The colonists did not. As we saw in the Seven Years' War, they were not the most well adapted when it came to fighting. They also, the British, realized that they really didn't have very much opposition when it came to having this control over the colonies, especially in terms of the Navy. We talked about how the Spanish were really upset by the British blockade and how that's going to hinder some of the Spanish trade and slowly eventually bring the Spanish into the war. So at the start of the war, on paper, it really looked like the British had the upper hand. Due to the native officer corps and considerable experience in colonial wars, however, the Patriot forces were not to be underestimated. The British are going to underestimate them, but slowly the anger and the hatred that the Patriots had is going to really play in their favor. In addition, they knew the land, they knew the waters, and they did have alliances, and they did have organizations that the British didn't appreciate. The British actually thought that the Revolutionary War, what would become the Revolutionary War, would be so easy that they could actually regain all political control over the colonies in just one military victory. They doubted the colonists that much. And to a certain extent, that doubt is going to be what hinders their ability to ultimately defeat the colonists. The strategy does not work due to the geography on eastern North America. We're able to do a rudimentary type of guerrilla warfare, the Patriots are, that really the British don't understand. They're very much used to having these very straightforward flanking maneuvers. And here, all of a sudden, you've got us running into woods and teaming up with natives and Spanish and French, and the British just were not prepared for as intense as this war was going to be. That being said, for a while, it certainly did look like the British were going to win. But we had the advantage of fighting on our own land, and we had the support for the idea of the American cause. Now, that being said, within America, there really were still two groups. You had loyalists and you had the patriots. The loyalists, you can see in this chart, it kind of breaks down the similarities and differences between the two. In case it's hard to read, the Loyalists had a strong, unified British Empire. They thought, we're already part of this empire. We need to try to get them to work with us. So the Loyalists don't want to completely break free and establish their own country because they were scared of being, the new guy on the block. What might that entail, and how are they going to rule themselves? They also still did think of themselves as British subjects and should therefore obey British laws. All right, we might not like these taxes, but we are British, and so therefore we have to live with them. That type of mentality. And then they realized that the taxes were due to the French and Indian Wars. And for the Loyalists, the French and Indian Wars, that was fought to protect the colonists. We know that's not really the case, but many viewed it in that regard. The Loyalists were scared that we might be weak without the British. And that we profited from trade with England. We couldn't sustain ourselves completely. We weren't highly trustworthy when it came to, are the French really going to trade with us? Are they not? They've gone into law, so they don't have a lot of land here. The Spanish, are they really going to trade with us? Are they going to take advantage of us? So there were quite a few, factors at play, and it seemed like if we could just get Britain to work with us, Britain is the safer bet. Furthermore, some loyalists argued that the Patriots who asking for representation within Parliament, that was just not realistic. Why should we have representation in a country so far away? We should just deal with it. We could have virtual representation. We didn't need direct representation, and we could still have some sort of a say in how we were governed. Loyalists were the minority. That being said, Loyalists were the minority within the colonies. The Patriots certainly had far more support. They said people have rights that government cannot take away. They are very influenced by the Enlightenment. Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, these guys, right? You're born with certain rights, and that those rights cannot be taken away without due process. The Patriots also argue that taxation takes away property. If you're spending so much money on, these taxes for stamps and tea and paper and cards and all this other stuff, you're not able to buy your own goods, and you don't have say over your own goods. And so they wanted to have more control over their own land and their own ideas, their self-determination. They didn't like that they had no say in Parliament, of course, so therefore their taxes were being mandated to them instead of them agreeing to them. It's like a little kid. They don't like being told what to do. If they have a say in it, they might at least somewhat pretend to listen. Also, the Patriots thought that there was no way colonies could ever be represented in Parliament. They said Parliament's so far away, they're never going to agree to us. Virtual, real, in any shape, way, or form. So it doesn't matter if we can elect people to somewhat represent us. They don't know what our life is like. They're not here, so why are they trying to tell us what to do? In addition, many colonists had fought in the French and Indian War. They said, we did our part, Britain. We tried to help you out. You kind of went back on a lot of your promises. We don't really like you. It's time for us to just break away and not try to have this animosity-ridden relationship anymore. And then lastly, the British personnel, as far as the Patriots were concerned, were the ones who were causing the violence and the riots and the deaths, such as the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. They said, you pushed us to these levels, but particularly with the Boston Massacre, who fired first? It wasn't the Patriots, so therefore the British are seen as the aggressors. So ultimately, this war breaks out. The Loyalists, they're not very active, but there are a lot who are going to try to eventually team up with the British forces who are here. Those guys after the war are either going to soften or hide their positions a lot. And then you have the Patriots. In terms of the Patriots, there were 350,000 eligible Patriots to fight at the start of the war. Of those 350,000, of the 350,000 eligible, over 200,000 are actually going to fight at some point in time. That being said, no more than 25,000 were engaged at one point, just because the population is so small. It's actually a small force. It might seem quite large, but we were so scared that, our population is relatively tiny at this time, especially compared to Britain. We don't want to risk all of the people that we possibly have, because then we would never be able to replenish our population and those types of things. By the end of the war, however, over 100,000 people had served in the Continental Army under George Washington and under the control of the Continental Congress. There were various other people who had served with the different Patriot militia groups, of which there were plenty. And really, the militia groups were very, very important in this war effort. These were much more localized. They didn't always directly report to the Continental Army, so sometimes they did strategies that Washington wouldn't have agreed with, or the Continental Congress wouldn't have agreed with. They were more willing to take greater risks, if you will. They viewed it as defending their own areas, but they did not alone win the Revolutionary War. So it's truly this combination of the formalized Continental Army working collaboratively with the militias that's ultimately going to win us the war. The militias, they potentially could have won the war on their own, but they lacked discipline. It was hard to get people to stay for a real long time. You would be drafted in for, a couple of months or up to a year, and then you were done your militia duty. It's kind of like the equivalent of our National Guard, It's not as full scale, let's say, as the established standing military. And there were also a lot of people who they thought it was just going to be this great adventure, and so they signed up en masse, get to their first battle, watch their friends die, march for miles and miles in the freezing cold wind, and they decide, I just don't like this. And so the militia really struggled in terms of having a lot of desertion, people who just up and quit the war. They weren't willing to keep trying anymore. So really, it was a combination of the two. We cannot downplay the militia, but it's very important to recognize that it was the established Continental Army that's going to do the bulk of the fighting. In terms of the forces also, Washington and his officers, they thought it was very important that their Continental Army could directly engage the British. Congress was a little bit, hesitant first to have a draft. They didn't want to come off as the bullies, oh, you have to come and fight with us. You have to do this. Every single person, every patriot, come and join. They would rather people just enlist for this cause. Because a lot of times, one of the biggest difficulties with the draft is if you are forced into military service, you don't tend to, and this isn't always the case, but you don't tend to fight as loyally and with as much heart and as much passion as if you volunteer. And so Congress was very hesitant and slow to go ahead and draft people. They were trying to escape this monarchy that had forced its will upon people. So how would Congress look if they started forcing their will on others? So there was this fear of a standing army. In the earliest battles, the militias therefore did most of the fighting. The militias were not being very successful. And so the Continental Congress is really going to use this as a justification to go ahead and enlist some form of a draft. They set quotas for the different states, like, oh, your state population is really high, so we want you to try to get a really high number of people to be in your military, XYZ. And what they're going to do to try to continue enlistments as well as the draft of a type of draft, but really just encourage these enlistment drives. The Continental Army is going to do stuff where they're going to offer bounties for people who ran away. They're going to allow you to buy others to do your service. They're going to actually give you regular wages so you could be a professional soldier. And this is one of the first times that this had happened in the American colonies. And they also promised that, after the American Revolution, if you had fought, if you had been this brave soldier who had risked your life, as a reward, you would be given some land. And so a lot of really, the poorer people saw this as their opportunity to get ahead after the war. It was important that the military, the Continental Army, be as disciplined as possible. This is a war that is very bloody. It's fought in very close range. You had rifles and muskets, and you're going to use a lot of bayonets. Those are like those guns that have like the little pointy, sticky, stabby thing at the end, if you haven't seen a bayonet. And that way you could go up and you could, stab people if your gun backfired, which is very often the case. And this war, was very costly. By the end, around 25,000 American men had died. Of those, 6,800 were from wounds, and then 8,000 plus some were from disease. And then the rest were either captured by the British, tortured. Some of the captures were sent back to England, sent into prisons, those types of things. And then some just disappeared. Most of them probably ran away and hid to avoid being redrafted or anything like this. Nonetheless, the Continental Army and the militias together are going to play a very, very, very important role when it comes to creating this idea of nationalism. We are together fighting for this overall goal. Let's team up. We have to be this unified front. There were instances where there wasn't enough food or there wasn't enough money to pay the soldiers, and so they did mutiny. But by and large, you see the birth of a truly American sentiment.